our third episode of Bridging the Divide, the interview series. Today, I'm really excited to be talking to everyone about how you don't need a great strategy. Now, before anyone has a nervous breakdown or says, Bridget, didn't you used to work for McKinsey? And is somebody going to come out and kill you in the dead of the night for saying such blasphemy? No. A great strategy is really overkill. What you need is a good strategy, because you are never going to get a great strategy that actually works and is still great by the end of the time that you need to work on it. So people who are working in product might know about minimum viable products. Well, today we're going to be talking about minimum viable strategy, our MVS. This is our way of thinking about how do we have a strategy that's good enough to get started, and how do we use that strategy to get to where we need to go. I am lucky enough today to have Kyle Keogh joining me. Now, in addition to being a fantastic person, Kyle is also my former colleague from IBM, also my former colleague from McKinsey, also a professor at NYU Stern, and currently the chief business officer at CoverGenius. So, big welcome to Kyle and his willingness to talk to us about, this unmentionable, not great strategy topic. And before we dive in, Kyle, I just gave a tiny bio on you by just shouting out what you've done. Can you tell us a little bit about you and why you care about not having a great strategy?
Sure. So first off, thank you for having me, Bridget. Very excited. Great to see you again. Always great to reconnect with old friends who have always enjoyed talking with and then debating these different ideas. So I joined CoverGenius recently after 16 years at Google. And, from our McKinsey and IBM early days, what I learned was it's important to have a great digital strategy and think through transformation. But when you start, it's really tough to know exactly where you should go. And spending too much time up front, you want to be clear on your objective, but flexible on your path. And so as we look at it, it's really understanding what does true north look like from a consumer standpoint, and then trying to figure out, okay, what are the right approaches and iterating your way there. Like spending too much time in advance, you'll never actually figure out what some of the big issues are until you actually get in there and really try it. And so that's been a lot of my experience when I was at Google working with telecom and auto clients, and now also at CoverGenius, where we're working with large institutions. And we can get started, but we know we'll be much better in 6 or 12 months than we'll be at the start. And we'll be that because we started earlier and we had that right iterative process. So excited to be here.
Fantastic. So, maybe we jump right in with the question that a lot of people are asking right now, which is, what's my ChatGPT strategy? So
yeah.
If somebody comes to you and asks that, what are you going to say to them?
So I think the first thing comes back to, I teach a strategy on digital disruption, oddly enough, at NYU Stern. And one of the key tenets is the consumer always wins, right? Any change that happens, there can be differences in the ecosystem, but the consumer always wins. And then there's usually value created across the ecosystem. There are then moments where something significant changes, though, and there's tremendous opportunity. And this is sort of like the beginning of mobile or even the beginning of the internet. It's a pretty transformational change. So you need to understand what is your true north that you're trying to get to. Like, how are you really going to help your consumers? And then work your way back to figure out how can ChatGPT or any of the other generative AI solutions really help you solve that. And if you can do that, you can add value for the consumer and probably take cost out for yourself.
But what I love about what you did is I asked, what's my ChatGPT strategy? And you said, what's my strategy that I should be doing to meet my consumer needs? And how do I use ChatGPT to do that? Which is a different thing and is the correct thing to do, right? I won't say I was trying to trip you up, because that would have been mean, but there is this sort of focus right now in the zeitgeist where people are saying, I need a strategy around, ChatGPT. And you don't. You need to be figuring out, are there ways to use ChatGPT to better do what you want to be doing for your customers?
I would agree. So even the internet or the birth of mobile was different because it was a new avenue to get to your consumers. This is much more like an Intel Inside strategy, right? It's not that it makes a computer, it makes the computer better. And so ChatGPT should be able to make what you do currently better as the first strategy around how it helps you. Then there are new things you probably can do, but if you don't know the consumer use cases, it's really hard to figure out how to use the technology. Technology should never drive your strategy. The consumer should always drive your strategy.
Fantastic. I think that's critical, and it's so important for us to be thinking as we're looking at, what am I in the business of doing? So,
Mhm.
I'm not there. There are a chunk of companies who are in the business of generative AI, and they
Mhm.
should have a generative AI strategy.
Correct.
Everyone else should have a strategy that at this point does include how might generative AI help me do what I want to do. Now, let's talk about where you might want to use generative AI. And I'm not going to say, this isn't going to be, hey, everybody needs to use it to do X.
Mhm.
But I'd love to talk a little bit about differentiation, because I think that a lot of times when people are thinking about what is my strategy, they're not linking it as firmly to an understanding of where they're differentiated as maybe they should be. Do you have some thoughts on this?
I do. So first off, there's two sides, right? There's what you can do for me, what you're doing already that's not necessarily differentiated, but will get better at what you're already doing. So this is, can you answer call center calls faster, right? And take out call center time. Those are helpful things to do. Good for the consumer. They're not dramatic changes. They don't change how the consumer experiences you. The differentiated ones, I would say Expedia did something amazing by actually changing their front interface and using ChatGPT to answer your questions. So instead of actually going into Expedia and saying, I want to take flights from here to there, and these are the times, you actually went into a basic text box, you gave them a short blurb, and they actually planned the whole trip for you. That to me was a client-facing, massive differentiating transformative experience from a client standpoint. I mean, how many flights have both of us been on, or business trips we've had to make where you're like, okay, I know exactly what I need to do, or I've never been to this place before, and it's been years since I was in Kansas City, and just having it say, I'm coming in at this time, I'm leaving at that time, I'm going to need a rental car, and having it set it all up for you is a seamless, brilliant, experience.
So I would say two things. One is I don't just want the flight and the rental car. I also want to know where the best barbecue is between the airport and where I'm meeting. So that's one thing.
Fair. Got to start with a minimum viable service or product, right? Before you get to what
Exactly.
you want.
You got to have the right barbecue before you dive in. The second thing is the example that you just gave. For me, it's interesting because it reminds me of one of my very favorite transformative examples in sort of the history of the internet. My belief is that one of the first times that you see somebody thinking about not how do I use the internet, but how do I deliver what my customer needs using the internet,
Mhm.
was when FedEx said, hey, rather than you calling up and sitting on the phone and telling us it's N12C, no, C as in Kathy, B as in boy, 75D, no, D as in David. Rather than doing that, you just typed it in, and you could type it in, like if you were anxious, you could type it in every 15 minutes if you wanted, or
Mhm.
really anxious every 5 minutes, right? So FedEx said, we're going to think about what it is people are trying to do, which is understand where their package is and make it easier for them to do it. And we can do that using the internet. By the way, to your point before, massive cost savings for FedEx in doing this, right? All of a sudden, people are doing self-serve and they're happier about it.
Cool.
So for me, that is like one of the first examples of a company truly understanding how to think differently about their business. Because they could have just had the call centers people using the web interface to do it. But that doesn't solve the problem, which is I want to know where it is, and it's hard to say all those numbers, et cetera.
Mhm.
The Expedia example to me is exactly there.
Yep. And so that in the Expedia example was real, right? ChatGPT came out in November, right? I think in February or March they launched this service. Now you're right; they need to add on barbecue. They should add on for us insurance, right? Do you want insurance? You can really put more into that, but you want to start with a minimum viable. So, like, okay, can I do this? And then continue forward on it. We're now talking ticketing companies are thinking about the same thing. You're going to the event, right? How do you want to think about your entire experience around the event, not just I'm going there and I want to see Taylor Swift, right? You're going to do a lot of things around that. So there's lots of moments where you're looking for help, right? And they can really make that better. Those are perfect examples in my mind of transformative change. And then the FedEx one is a perfect one of like, this is an annoying thing I'm going to have to do. I want to know when my package gets here. You want to make that as simple as possible because it's not a huge value added moment. It's a de-stress moment though. So it's great.
And one of the things though that I'm hearing as you're talking is this opportunity for people to go down a slippery slope, which is I can do a whole bunch of things. Why don't I do all of them? And the problem is that technology sometimes makes it easier to see that, to think that you can do them all.
Mhm.
But I'm a big believer in you should only do those things that you are differentiated in and strategically differentiated in.
Mhm.
And everything else you should outsource. I mean, in my mind, it's like there's an API for that.
Okay. So yes, and though what I would say is there's stuff that you can deliver that is you can do through partnerships. You can deliver a differentiated, amazing experience. Some of it you may say, I don't want to do this. This is not my business. Part of the thing that brought me to CoverGenius is it's important to have insurance on a flight or for an event or for a product warranty for something, but it's not usually strategic for the company that's actually delivering it. They're in the flights business, right? They want to get you from A to B. Should be a service that your customer should value, but is not truly something is going to be your end differentiator. So why wouldn't you outsource for that, right? It's valuable for your consumer, but not something you're amazing at. But it is something we're really good at, and so there's great partnership there. But then also to that point is then you also have to decide how much do you want to put in that solution, right? Going back to the Expedia thing is, okay, I care about flights. I need a hotel. I probably may or may not want a rental car. I may or not want insurance. The barbecue one, there's a set of them that you then need to figure out, okay, how's Bridget different from Kyle? And how do I think about that targeting? But, ChatGPT and those capabilities will be there, right? So you start with one and then it's going to allow tremendous personalization, but it allows you to iterate earlier with a minimum viable service as you talked, or strategy as you talked about, and then iterate to that. Because now in a tech world, in a digital world, you can truly do A/B testing at scale fairly quickly, and you can iterate on a moment's notice, which is not something that was true when strategy was developed. Even when we were back we were at McKinsey in the late 90s, early 2000s, like you couldn't iterate that same way you can now.
It is interesting to think about this ability to check whether something's working. I think that the warning that I just want to make sure everybody is really aware of, because to me it's this big red light that nobody else can see because it's aren't actually seeing it, flashing that says don't try to do everything yourself. Because look, I know I was working with a financial services company one time, and they were like, look, we have the best engineers in the business. I'm like, you guys have awesome engineers. And to be real, they did. They had awesome engineers. And they're like, so we're going to build our entire tech stack. And I was like, you're going to what? Like, you're a financial services company. You are supposed to be helping people pay bills and transfer money and all of these things that they were supposed to be focused on. And they had this idea that since they had really smart engineers, really smart developers, and they had really smart ones, that they should do everything, literally from the very bottom of the stack to the very top of the stack. And my point to them was, you guys are going to go out of business before you're done, because there are companies that do these other things and do it well enough. Maybe your guys could do it better. Your guys are smart. Probably they could do it better because they know they could tune it exactly to what you need. However, is that actually going to give you enough benefit for not having those really smart engineers 100% focused on this layer of differentiation that you have?
100%. Strategy is as much about deselection as it is about selection, right? And it's deselecting what you either shouldn't do at all or what you should outsource and use someone else for. And understanding, to your point, where you truly differentiated on. The other thing you didn't say is, but where you were going to is, your best engineers want to work on your differentiated products, right? You're going to wind up in, as much as you may have great engineers, not everyone's going to be perfect. And you're going to wind up with this system where you're going to be either pulling your best engineers off your best products, which are critical to your business, or you're going to wind up with not your best engineers on the less critical products. And as a result, you're head to head not going to actually do better than a Salesforce or someone else. Um, and is that truly a differentiator to your business, right? Is that going to drive material change? So the selection has to be based on what is strategic for your business and what can you really execute on. And if it's not strategic and you can't out execute everybody else, that's a clear sign to outsource or just completely deprioritize.
Yeah. And one thing that you actually have said to me before is that your engineers are going to leave if they're not on the big projects, right? Like, yes, you have the best engineers right now, but it's not like they're imprisoned in your company and that you can't, and they aren't going to leave for 30 years, right? Like, the best engineering talent is something that you need to take care of. And part of taking care of good engineering talent is giving them challenges that are at the center of the business strategy. If you're not doing that, you're going to lose them. And then you're just going to have not so good engineers on across everything.
Totally. You need to give them something that's critical, something they feel meaning and purpose in doing and pride when they deliver, and also something's pretty technically challenging, right? That they can look at and be like, that was a really hard challenge I solved, right? And give them some latitude to do that, right? Saying, hey, I need you to build this base product. Not very exciting for a lot of folks, very rote. And that's tough to be inspiring when you're building a product that no one's ever going to see or care about.
Right. So as we think about, okay, you don't need a great strategy, but this doesn't mean you just can take a plan and move forward, right? It's not like, okay, well, I'm going to roll out ChatGPT and, stick it on my website. You do need a good enough strategy. So how do you think about what is really good enough to get started? Like, what does good enough look like for you?
Sure. So to me, the first thing, as we talked about, is you have to know what true north is, right? What is the consumer problem you're trying to solve? And you need to be at least as good as what anything else is out there, if not slightly better, right? So you have to think about what is there, if you go back to our negotiations classes, what's our BATNA? What's our best alternative to a negotiated agreement, right? So, or what's our comparison, right? Am I at least as good on most elements and distinctive on one in what I'm offering? And that should get you started. And then do you have the right discipline and approach to actually go after it? Do you have the right partners who are willing to innovate with you? Do you have the discipline internally to know and say, and to support and kill things, right? To know this part worked and it's great and let's keep going, and this part didn't. And killing it is actually something that should be applauded, right? Okay, this didn't work. Let's cut it and move on. That's hard for a lot of companies. And do you have the data and the processes to do all of this? So if you have a minimum viable strategy and you're launching towards something and you have the processes, the discipline, the people support, and the systems, you can actually go much further faster. If you don't have those, though, if you don't have the right people who have an approach that it allows iterative, you don't have the data coming from systems, you don't have the process to have checkpoints and gating, then these get tougher, right? And those are huge differentiators. Is not your ability to win straight out of the gate, but to win over time because you've out executed the competition.
So I like to say to people that the only thing I hate worse than processes are no processes. So, it's interesting somebody coming from a big company like IBM to say I hate processes, because one of the first things people think of when they think of a big company is processes. And truly, processes can, strangle you if you let them get out of control. But if you don't have them, you are never going to know whether you're working on the right things, whether your people are appropriately deployed, whether you've met your original goals, whether you're headed in the right direction, right? Because you won't be consistently enough checking yourself against your success metrics. You won't be measuring whether or not you are still differentiated, et cetera.
True. And you need to make sure your processes, so you're clear on the strategy and the metrics for the strategy, and then the processes support that, and that they match the size of the company, right? At a really big company like IBM, like a T&E policy or process can save, tens of millions of dollars. That doesn't do that at a small company, right? So you want to make sure you're really matching it up versus getting to the right product market fit. Incredibly important for a smaller company.
Right. So I think when we think about this focus on, hey, have a good strategy, move forward with it. A good strategy can't stand in a vacuum, right? It has to have, first of all, a good strategy for a Fortune 500 company is going to look different from a good strategy for a Series A funded company, right? They both need good strategies to go towards their North Star, but what good is changes. And the way that you support good, iterate on good, is going to change for them. I think that's a great point.
It's true, and then let's take it even for within a big company, right? So you've got a big area that you've been doing for a really long time that has definite processes. Everyone should know their role. You get to a new nascent product, right? Like this is, developing ChatGPT. It was OpenAI, but it was very much funded by Microsoft. That needed a different set of processes. So you can have two different things within the same company that require totally different processes, depending on the maturity of that business, to support it. And it's hard as companies grow up, they go through different stages, and you need to have the processes and this to just to match the level that you're in for each business unit.
Right. And I think getting a lot of times that can be hard for small company people to get their head around processes being a good thing, right? Because I think a lot of people who join small companies do it because they don't want to be constrained by some of the red tape, et cetera, of big companies. Um, and I think that's when it becomes important to say, look, you might not like processes, but you're going to like no processes even less. It really is painful.
Well, also depending on what level you are in the organization, processes can start to feel constraining, especially if the why is not there. If you don't understand how to do it, but you don't understand why you're doing it and what the impact of it is, that's hard. And then companies that get bigger, like they start to get really good at processes. So they start adding more and more of them. And the diminishing marginal returns, they go beyond that level. So the smaller companies, they don't have any, right? So you have to find that right zone for the stage of the company. It's always some process, but it depends on the size and the scale and the complexity.
Potentially, we also need a minimum viable process, but we can't do that because that would be MVP, which is already product. So we've got to figure out a different way to solve that problem of the minimum viable processes that you need to be successful as a business. So speaking of success, how do you measure success? I mean, I come back to the point that, okay, a good strategy, good, like people are like, yeah, but I want to be wildly successful. I want to double my business. I want to go exponential. Like, how do you know? And when you're going to something that's a North Star, it's not like necessarily something you know exactly where it is.
Mhm.
Sometimes people struggle with measuring on, am I making progress?
Fair. So, so I often come back to the end consumer, right? Excuse me. If the end consumer sees value, you're probably doing well. And then how many end consumers you're actually able to get to, right? If you have something that does it, if you think about it, everybody brushes their teeth every day, right? Hopefully, hopefully twice a day, in fact. So you want to get in, and if you can touch every person in, say, America twice a day, right? That's incredibly impactful, even if it's a small thing that you're doing, right? Brushing your teeth is not a huge action. So you can get, little bit of impact per person with lots of people, or you can go really deep and be very successful with a smaller set. Depends on what your business is as to what you want to do there. But I think first you start with the end consumer, and then you have to work back through everybody in the ecosystem. Unless everyone in the ecosystem wins, at some point, the person who loses, unless you totally cut them out, which like lots of companies have done, right? The camera companies got shut out with Apple adding cameras there, and then they weren't that important for them. But unless they're cut out, at some point, if there's not value for everyone, you're going to have some trouble. And so you've got to make sure that the pie is big enough that it can feed everybody, and then you can get your more than your fair share. But you've got to make sure that everybody has some success. And if otherwise, at some point, one of those people is going to undercut you.
That's so interesting. When I was building IBM Food Trust, which was our blockchain food safety solution, because it was blockchain based, it was all about the ecosystem. And when we were we were one of those entrepreneurship things, right? A small company within a really big company. And we got to set our own metrics. And I got some pretty senior support saying, we're not going to have revenue be one of our first most important things, because we wanted to figure out whether we could get everybody in, everybody engaged. And that meant some of them were paying, some of them weren't, because sometimes in order to get the entire win-win that you were talking about, you needed to be balancing it. And so I'm not saying that like revenue growth in particular segments wasn't important, but the overall revenue wasn't our primary target, because part of it was, how do we build support for this ecosystem as a way to start? So I think that thinking about, maybe it's some obvious metrics turned on their head, maybe it's not even obvious metrics, but having those metrics to say, am I sure that I'm heading in the right direction? Am I sure I'm getting the kind of traction that I want? That's really going to help you figure out what good looks like.
And then there's some interim metrics in between, because revenue is a trailing metric, right?
Yeah.
You're there successful. Had a really smart person tell me, Kyle, if you have a win rate less than 33%, you have a product market fit issue. If you have a win rate over 30%, you probably have good product market fit and you can actually scale. Thought that was a good baseline to think about it. It's a rule of thumb, not perfect, but if you're below 30%, it can be a sales challenge. You can have some issues, but realistically, if you see that across the board, at some point you've actually got a product market fit issue. So that, but if you see variability and you're well above 30%, okay, now you've actually got a good product market fit. Now you've got a go-to-market challenge, and you have to think about how you want to go to market that way. So that's a set that works for some areas, but in the end, everybody needs to win for this to win, and everyone needs to see value from that and have a long-term view that they can actually get value out of it. So I'm sure you were not looking at revenue in the short term, but you knew, okay, if this works, you were forecasting, here's what I think we can do then later on. So here's your early proof points, will get you here to get you to launch is not what's necessarily going to get you to scale, but you needed to set up to prove that you could scale. You need the consumers to say yes before you can ever figure out if you really have a good product or a good business. It's the old Webvan. They had a great solution. They just were way ahead of their time, and they didn't win the customers first.
It's amazing. It always does come back to the customers, doesn't it? Like, that's the way you know whether you have a good strategy.
So here at CoverGenius, we try to make sure we're adding value to the end consumer who's buying the policy. We fit right within our partners' go to market, and it's very helpful for them from a consumer value standpoint, and they're also making money on it. That we do well, and that all the insurance partners we work do well. And we have to make sure that entire ecosystem is successful. And when everyone's successful, to varying degrees, but when everyone's successful, it works really, really well. But it all starts with the consumer.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it is kind of one of those perfect examples of, hey, this is something everybody could do, but if everybody's going to do it and it's going to be about the same and it's not going to differentiate them when they do it, why would they bother doing it? That's exactly when you want a partner to do it. Totally. Because it's not going to differentiate you. It's going to maybe differentiate your entire market against other markets. Hey, we want people flying instead of people driving cars, and they're going to do that if this is seen as less risky. So you can help the whole market by having everybody use it, or you can just help yourself by lowering your cost basis by having somebody do it in what for you becomes almost a commoditized way, right? Because you're saying that's not a differentiation for me. These guys are the ones who do it really well. So I'm going to choose them. And even if my competitors choose them, the way that I fit them into everything else I do is what's going to differentiate me.
And in the digital world, yes, and then ecosystems are right out there to take advantage of, right? You can pull in and you can use a CRM system. The barriers to starting a new business are so much lower now than they were 20 years ago. And the ability to partner by just integrating to an open API with someone else is so low that you can really partner in ways that you couldn't have in 20 years ago, or even 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah. There's an app for that.
Totally true.
Well, Kyle, thank you so much for coming and talking about why a good strategy is critical and a great strategy is overkill. Appreciate your perspective.
Thanks so much, Bridget. Great to see you and great to hopefully this was helpful.
Okay. I'll talk to you soon. Everybody else, turn in next time for another great episode of Behind the Scenes on what you need to know for digital transformation. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks all.